Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today. My name is Ann Crawford and I'm the Reference and Adult Services Librarian at the Ponte Vedra Beach Branch Library. And today I wanted to share with you children's, teen, and adult books about two incredible American civil rights heroes, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the late John Lewis, both who passed in 2020. Now, I was really excited about getting prepared for this program because sometimes, unfortunately, it takes the passing of someone who's an icon for you to realize that maybe you don't know as much about them as you wanted to or felt that you needed to know. And that's where the People's University comes in. And you might be thinking, what is the People's University? Well, the People's University is just another name for your public library. So you're always just one checkout away with your St. Johns County Library card from finding out more information about anything that you want to know about people, about places, about history, about making a new recipe, or learning about how to use the technology that we're all kind of inundated with. So really, the People's University, your public library, is your ticket to find out more, particularly about when people who are almost larger than life pass away and you think to yourself, like I did, gosh, I wish I knew more about all the things that they did. I knew them on a general level, but I'd love to know more details. And that's what some people are doing right now. They're checking out books about John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg to do just that, find out more. So some of these books you may already be on request for, some you may not be, some you may never have heard of before, but I can tell you this much, in having gone through these children's, teen, and adult books about two of these American heroes, I've learned much more about them than I knew before. And that's, again, one of the wonderful things about public libraries or the People's University. You're never too young or too old to find out more about anything you could possibly want to know. Let's go ahead and dive into these books. I have a list at the end of this presentation of all the titles that I covered, so you don't have to feel compelled to scribble everything down on a piece of paper. I provided the book list at the end, and I hope to do that in future programs in case you'd like to request the books that I suggest and find out more for yourself. So as I go through these books, I'm going to tell you a little factoids and things like that I learned from each of these books. And again, by no means have I learned everything there is to know about Ruth Bader Ginsburg or John Lewis, but I did learn enough to know that their missions in life were very compatible and comparative, because both of them dedicated their lives and their lifelong pursuits and their livelihoods to the equal rights of not just themselves, but for all people in America. And that's something worth celebrating. So let's go ahead and dive into these books. All right, so our first book here is Preaching to the Chickens, the story of a young John Lewis. So what I thought I'd do with both John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is I'd start with the children's books, the teen books, and then the adult books. And in that way, I can also kind of tell you in a biographical sense a little bit about each person. So in this book, I learned that John Lewis was raised on a farm in Troy, Alabama. He was one of 10 children born to his parents. And all the children took care of the chickens on the farm, but John especially loved those chickens. He knew them, he could recognize and know every single one and had names for them. The only thing that he loved more than tending to the chickens was attending his family's church and getting dressed up on Sundays to go. And he loved hearing the preacher talk about the word of God and the good news. And he was really inspired to preach to a congregation himself. Now that wouldn't come about until probably about the time he was 15 years old, which I found out in one of the other books that I read about him. But that didn't stop him, because he figured he had a congregation of his own right there on the farm, the chickens. So every week when he would learn new things at church, he would go home and preach to his congregation, the chickens. And he learned all sorts of valuable life lessons. For example, about sometimes you have to speak up for others because they can't speak up for themselves. So when someone came by the farm and wanted to trade for a hen, John found something else on the farm to trade with and protected that hen. And that was how it mentions in this book, inspired him to start thinking about how he could not only advocate for himself, but advocate for others. So it's a really wonderful book, beautifully illustrated. The next book is also in the Children's Department called John Lewis, Get to Know the Statesman Who Marched for Civil Rights. So this starts to get into John Lewis, the civil rights activist, and the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which eventually became the John Lewis Bridge, and what that march represented and how dangerous that march was. So this gets a little bit more into him, not all the way to where he's a congressman, but certainly no longer living on the farm in Troy, Alabama. And one of the common threads that I learned about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but particularly about John Lewis, was that he was so integral to the civil rights movement, to equal rights. And he was, rubbing elbows with all sorts of big names like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. And I thought, I never learned about him in school. And again, that's another reason I'm so grateful to public libraries, because, even if it's been years since you've been in school, which for me it has, or if you've never gone to college or anything like that, it's never too late to find out more. So like I said, that library card, you're one checkout away from anything that you want to know. And then as we get a little bit older, we have March. Now this is a graphic novel series for teens. Of course, anybody can read it. It's in 3 volumes, and it's all about that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and what that represented. And again, like I said, the danger that they faced and what they were trying to convey in a peaceful demonstration. And so it's won a lot of awards. And what's really interesting is next April, 2021, he'll be coming out with a new trilogy that's, instead of being called March, it's called Run. So basically you've marched over the bridge and now you have to run for it. So I'm interested to see where the story gets taken next, because this is all just the beginning. There was so much that he did in his lifetime, and it just blew me away how much he dedicated his life not only to the pursuit of equal rights for himself, but for all number of people that may or may not have had the ability or the courage to fight that fight. So, what else was John Lewis during the civil rights movement? Well, in addition to marching across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, he was also one of the Freedom Riders. He was at college in Tennessee when the Freedom Riders came to town. And the interesting thing about that is that the reason he was in college in Tennessee was because he'd applied to college in Alabama but had been rejected because of his race. Not because of his qualifications or missing any deadlines, simply because of his race. He wrote to Martin Luther King Jr., his mentor, idol, hero, who then invited him for a meeting and called him that boy from Troy, and told him he could sue the university, however, the backlash would come back on his family. So that's why he decided to go to college in Tennessee. And it's fortunate that he did, because he was in the right place at the right time, that the Freedom Riders needed another galvanizing push to get to the end of their mission. So that's where John Lewis came in. And I think I read that he was arrested 43 times, and he was badly beaten as part of the Freedom Riders and as part of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He had a scar on his skull from being beaten. So he really took it all the way to the finish line, because he felt that was a fight that was really worth putting everything on the line. So this one's for teens. So oftentimes when you see teen fiction, little less solid, tiny print of words after words after words, a little bit more visuals and things like that. So if you've got a middle schooler or a high schooler that wants to learn more about John Lewis, that in conjunction with the graphic novel series is a great way to do it. Now on to John Lewis as an adult. So he wrote his own memoir, which both he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, which is interesting because then you really get inside the head of the person in the moment, what they were thinking, why they were doing what they're doing, why it mattered so much. But he also has some interesting books in that book, that first memoir, was written in 1998, 99, and the second book was written in 2017. And that to me is really interesting because there's almost 20 years apart there. And you can imagine that his perspective 20 years later with his life experiences and just being older, a little bit more wise, had a different feeling to it. It had a much more philosophical feel. And very much the feeling in this book when reading it is, this is what has been done, this is what I'm trying to do, and this is what I am encouraging the next generation to pick up the charge and continue to go forward and try and ensure equal rights for all. So like I said, a different vibe, two different memoirs written 20 years apart. Now the newest book about John Lewis, and the one that I'm doing for our February book club read for the Wednesday book club here at the Ponte Vedra Beach Ranch Library, is His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. So I'm really looking forward to all of us reading this book. This time it's not written by John Lewis, it's written by somebody else. It's mostly encapsulating his childhood and the civil rights movement, so it doesn't really get into him as a congressman, so it's a very specific amount of time. But unlike in an autobiography where you might feel self-conscious about patting yourself on the back and seeming too self-congratulatory when someone else is writing about you and has accomplished the things that John Lewis had accomplished on behalf of so many, then it's not hard to really acknowledge that and underline that for people. So that was another interesting take, and I think it's going to be a great Black History Month book club read. And it's got a bit of a wait list on it right now, but that's no reason that you shouldn't get on the wait list too. And this one is available both in print format as well as ebook format. Now, both Ruth Bader Ginsburg and John Lewis have in common that they have their own documentaries. So sometimes seeing is believing. You can read about a person, but sometimes seeing clips from their past and hearing them talk in the past really brings that history to life. And this documentary, John Lewis, Good Trouble, you've probably heard that phrase before, came out at the end of September 2020. And so quite the documentary to watch, to really not only learn about him and to see clips from his own life and the civil rights movement, but also hear what contemporary people think about what he did, what he enabled them to do as a result of his hard work, his blood, sweat, and tears. So if you're looking for a good documentary, I recommend John Lewis, Good Trouble. Now, over to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you're going to see that they're really not all that different from one another. They really had, like I said, a very similar mission, kind of a similar launching point, and certainly very similar experiences as children. Now, whereas John Lewis was a Black American and he was poor and he lived in Alabama, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a girl and she lived in New York and she was Jewish. But they encountered some of the same roadblocks as children, and a lot of signs, unfortunately, that said no blacks allowed, no Jews allowed. They were told that there were things they just couldn't possibly do, told things that they couldn't possibly accomplish. And it didn't matter what merit that they had. It didn't matter that these things they were being judged on were not anything they had done by choice, not anything they had any choice in. But both of them experienced those inequities and unfairness. And it inspired both of them to think about, were they going to live in a world like that, or were they going to do something about it? Now, with John Lewis, his idol, his mentor, his hero was Martin Luther King Jr., and that propelled him into the civil rights movement, along with, unfortunately, the lynching of Emmett Till. And because he died about the same age John was at the time, which was 15. Now for Ruth, it was a little bit different. For Ruth, she was getting hit twice. She was getting put down because she was a girl. She was getting put down because she was a Jew. But her mother believed no matter that she was a girl, no matter that she was a Jew, she was going to do great things, and she shouldn't let anything stand in her way. And if it was standing in her way, she needed to figure out how to make it not stand in her way. So Ruth very much admired her mother. You get to learn a lot about her mother and their relationship in this book. And sadly, probably the jumping off point for Ruth Bader Ginsburg was when she lost her beloved mother to illness the day before she was supposed to graduate from high school and give a speech. She didn't end up going to graduation. She didn't end up getting that speech. And in fact, when her mother's funeral was arranged, she unfortunately found out that because she was a girl, there were many parts of the funeral that she couldn't assist with. So she decided to go to college and learn all that she could possibly learn. And during that time in college, she met a man named Marty Ginsburg. And thus the big love affair began. And Marty was studying to be a lawyer, so Ruth decided, well, lawyers get to argue whether or not laws are fair or unfair and get to make some change in the world. So she decided she would study to be a lawyer too. And she was one of 9 women in her college studying law. And it was very clear in every arena that there were people who seriously wondered why these 9 women took the spots of men who could have been lawyers. And despite all of her efforts to work hard, despite all of Marty's support, it's amazing to think that she graduated from college without any job offers. And it just blew my mind, because that was life for women in the 1950s. It's almost, I can't reconcile that in my mind here in the 2020s. So that's a little bit of what is talked about in I Dissent, one of my daughter's new favorite books that she's going to read at her school. And it was about how when Marty was sick, Ruth stepped up and helped him with his law classes, helped him with his law papers, in addition to her own workload, in addition to having a small baby at home and being married. And then when the tables turned and it was Ruth's time to shine, Marty Ginsburg rolled up his sleeves and he was cooking for the family, cleaning for the family, taking care of his kids. Basically, they lived out the modern marriage, which was almost unheard of in the 1950s. And she really believed that that marriage should be an option on the table. Was it necessarily what every couple would decide to do? No. But it needed to at least be something that was possible, that if you wanted to do it, that the stigma was gone. So she worked very hard, and she finally got work with a judge, and she tried all sorts of cases, and she also argued many of those cases to the Supreme Court long before her appointment to the Supreme Court. So I Dissent reminds us of how much Ruth Bader Ginsburg was faced with adversity and said, no, this isn't right. This is how it should be. Women and girls should have these opportunities. They should be able to make their own choices. And that was a big part of her life's mission. And it's talked about some more in another children's picture book biography, Ruth Objects. This is a great series that also includes Martin's Big Words, and there's a book about Helen Keller, and they're beautifully illustrated, wonderfully done, and talk about the trials and tribulations that Ruth felt and how she really broke down some walls and broke down some barriers, just like John Lewis, which was really impressive to me. And the wonderful thing about these children's books is they distill that information in such a way that it's very easy to digest for a child. And particularly as I have a daughter, it really blew her mind how much of her life is possible because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. One simple example of many would be the fact that she's played soccer since she was 3. She's 9 now. And prior to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in Title IX, she wouldn't have been able to do any of that. We were able, as her parents, to sign her up for girls' soccer and didn't bat an eyelash, didn't think a thing about it. But it's really interesting to know that at one time that was just not done. It just didn't work that way. So this is a children's graphic novel, Becoming RBG, and I love graphic novels because, like I said, they kind of give you a visual to go along with the information. And one of the things that I found out in this book that really impressed me was that sometimes the assumption is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg only fought on behalf of women, and women being stereotyped and judged and withheld from things that they wanted to do and not given the opportunities they should be. And that's true, she did. But she also fought on behalf of men. And you might think, well, what do men have to fight for? Weren't they getting everything that they wanted and they weren't being held back? Not true. I found out in this book that there was a case where a young couple had gotten married, had a baby, and very sadly and tragically, the mother died hours after giving birth to that baby. And everyone told the dad, you just need to give that baby up for adoption. You can't raise that baby. Men don't raise babies. But he really wanted to raise his baby. And in this day and age, I can imagine there would have been much more pushback from the dad. But at that time, it was just unheard of. Well, just as a mother can receive benefits if her spouse dies, he assumed that because the mother passed, that then he could receive those benefits that would then help him to raise his child. And he was told, no, sorry, you can't have those benefits because you're the father. Those are a mother's benefits. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that was incredibly unfair. Why shouldn't he also have some support to take care of his child, just as a widowed mother would have if her husband passed away? And so she fought for that. So she didn't just fight for girls, and she didn't just fight for people who looked exactly like her or were the same religion as her. She fought for anybody that she felt was not given a fair opportunity to do the things they needed and wanted to do. So I learned that from a children's graphic novel, and you can too. And of course, you've probably heard the name Notorious RBG, play on Notorious B.I.G. And one of the things that's really interesting about this book is that this is in a long line of books, which I think is a really neat idea, of where they have an adult nonfiction book, and at the same time they publish a young reader's edition. So in theory, an adult in a family could be reading this book, and then a child in the family that's in upper elementary school, middle school perhaps, or something like that, maybe even high school, could read the young reader's edition, and then they could share what they learned and the ideas and the inspirations. So that's really neat. There's actually several books out there in our library system that have the adult version as well as the young reader's version. So it's a great way to create dialogue and have the family talk about what you're thinking about this person and how did they impact your life, and what do you do when you realize something is completely and utterly unfair to you or someone else? Do you stand up? Do you speak out? Do you try to, bring about change? And how does that work? So that's a really neat opportunity if you wanted to read kind of side by side and then be able to share. Usually the young reader's edition is a little bit, depending on the material, a little bit more toned down, a little bit more condensed, maybe the vocabulary is a little bit simplified, but they still get the essential ideas behind the work. Now this one is Conversations with RBG, and it was interesting because of course it's her answering questions back and forth. So you're getting that dialogue, which is always interesting, which is a little different from a biography, because instead of the person telling you all about their life, they're answering questions about their life and how it all works. And so I thought it was a really interesting book. It came out in 2019. It's got a wait list on it, but again, it's in print and it's an ebook format, so put yourself on that list. It's really, really interesting. And I believe it was this book or My Own Words by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is a biography, where I learned about her friendship with Justice Scalia. And I just thought that was the neatest thing. She called him Nino. I think his name was pronounced Antonin if I'm right about that, but she called him Nino. They were two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of ideas and, politics and about, being conservative or being liberal. I mean, just two opposite ends of the spectrum, and they were the best of friends. Nino, as she called him, bought her 24 roses for her birthday, and someone who was in his office said, oh, well, trying to sweeten the vote and get her to vote on your side. And he said, some things are more important than votes. And he's right, absolutely. And he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg had the most interesting friendship. He writes about it in his book, Scalia Speaks, which we also own in the library. And they just had a really neat dynamic. They would help each other write basically their talking points for the Supreme Court, and they would help each other with their grammar and to make sure that they got their points across as best as possible, despite the fact that oftentimes their points were diametrically opposed. So last but not least, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has her own documentary, Hero, Icon, Dissenter. It's got a big wait list on it. Get yourself on that list. That brings my presentation to a conclusion. Never forget the People's University, the fact that you're one checkout away from anything and everything that you want to know. And certainly, before someone who's larger than life, that's really made an impact on the world, before they pass, find out more about them. You'll be surprised at how much you'll find out and just how incredibly interesting it is. So again, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.